evening. Welcome to Ottawa Experts. I'm your host, Barbara Balfour. October 17, mark it on your calendars. It is the day marijuana legalization will be enacted across Canada, and it will create arguably the biggest legal cannabis economy in the world. Legalization also raises a wide range of policy issues, and one of the most contentious is the health impact of legalization on young people. So how do we mitigate the risks? How can we close some of the regulatory gaps? And as Canadian cannabis producers are setting their sights on global domination, and as medical marijuana is being legalized around the world, what are some of the biggest opportunities in our economy? I'm pleased to introduce a range of guests to discuss these issues and answer your questions tonight. Don't forget to call into the show at 613-728-1001 to ask your questions. First, I'd like to introduce Eugene Oscapella. He is a lawyer who has lectured on drug policy at the University of Ottawa for almost 2 decades, and he is regularly invited to speak on privacy and drug policy topics in Canada and around the world. Welcome to the show, Eugene.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Rebecca Jessiman. She is the Director of Policy at the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction. She has been a respected expert on cannabis policy for over a decade. Rebecca is currently examining alternative mechanisms for the regulation of controlled substances with an emphasis on a public health approach. Thank you so much for joining us, Rebecca.
Good evening.
On the phone with us now, joining us from Vancouver, is a high-profile cannabis activist that some people has referred to as Canada's Princess of Pot. Jody Emery has been the owner and operator of Cannabis Culture magazine, Pot TV, and Cannabis Culture head shops and lounges since 2009. And she has recently opened Jody's Joint, a new hemp-themed coffee shop in Toronto's Kensington Market. Thank you so much for joining us, Jody. Are you on the line?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for joining us. Now, later on in the show, we'll also be joined by psychotherapist Deborah Brooks. She is an addictions counselor working in mental health for the last 15 years and is currently based out of Serenity Renewal for Families, so make sure you stick around for that. So I have to say, and I did bring this up briefly in our conversation on the telephone, Eugene, is I was struck by the number of stakeholders that I spoke with that were very reticent to speak because they said there's still so many unknowns in this debate, and yet we're only weeks away from showtime. October 17 will be fast upon us. So I want to hear from both of you what your thoughts are on the policies we're facing, but I thought perhaps we could start with Jody, the entrepreneur on this panel. Jody, why don't you take us through how you got here as a cannabis activist and what some of your frustrations have been running a business in this industry? You know, what are some of the most glaring inconsistencies for you?
When I was in high school, I was actually opposed to cannabis and all drugs, and I evolved over time when I realized that the criminal law causes far more harm to people than cannabis ever has, and even worse, the government propaganda about cannabis scares people away from the safer choice. I personally have used cannabis to end my use of illegal drugs that are harmful and antidepressant pharmaceuticals. So cannabis has saved my life and many others. When I began activism in 2004, I was the editor of Cannabis Culture magazine. Mark Emery, my husband, sold marijuana seeds and financed court challenges and ballot initiatives all around the world to challenge and change the laws. So I never actually openly broke the law until very recently in 2016 when Mark and I and my Cannabis Culture organization opened up storefronts that were designed to represent what legalization should look like. Adults buying access cannabis easily without any punishments or restrictions and a sort of civilized manner. But of course, in the years past, Mark was arrested by the U.S. government in Canada. He faced life in U.S. prison for financing cannabis law reform through seed sales. And I spent nearly 5 years visiting him in U.S. prison, where I witnessed firsthand the drug war and prohibition impact on families, particularly people of color. And in Canada, we still know that the arrests continue, the disproportionate nature of the law enforcement continues, and for me, that's the top reason to legalize cannabis, to end the unjust criminalization of peaceful, nonviolent people and the consensual transactions between adults. Unfortunately, the Liberal plan restricts and limits cannabis. It prevents pioneers and prohibition victims from getting access, and it enriches big business and big government and a lot of former cops and politicians, while continuing to cast aside those who fought to change the laws and who were unfairly persecuted. So I do have many concerns, and I'm still trying to find a way to get legal myself, but I do have significant roadblocks in the way.
Thanks, Jody. Eugene, as a lawyer with a background in this area, does anything about Jody's story resonate with you?
Oh, absolutely. Much of what Jody says makes perfect sense. I mean, we chose in 1923 to criminalize cannabis, to make it a criminal offense to possess, to produce, to distribute cannabis, and that was a very significant mistake. We took what should be a social and a health issue and turned it into a criminal justice issue. And in the criminal law is by and large a very, very blunt instrument for dealing with social policy issues. It was not the appropriate mechanism for dealing with cannabis. And we've skewed our whole approach to other drugs. We've got alcohol, which in many ways is a far more dangerous drug than cannabis, and we lionize that, we advertise it, we think that's fine if people are using alcohol, despite the harm that it causes in society. And yet we've demonized drugs like cannabis. We haven't had what you might call rational pharmacology, because in large part we've arbitrarily decided to criminalize some drugs, cannabis being one of them, and to deal with it through the criminal law rather than treating it as a health and a social issue.
Rebecca, what do you think?
I certainly agree that we need to look at the issue of cannabis, as with all substance use, as a health and social issue. Personally, I come from a public health perspective on this, and but some of what Jody said certainly still resonated with me, particularly in terms of the disproportionate arrests that she mentioned in the United States with visible minorities. From a public health perspective, it's not just about health promotion, but it's also about equity. And that's making sure that there are no particular populations that are disproportionately impacted by the new regulations.
So I can conclude that both of you are for legalization and decriminalization of marijuana?
Well, it's a very broad question. I'm sure we would disagree on some aspects of it, but the notion of, certainly in my perspective, moving away from using the criminal law as the primary instrument for dealing with all drugs, cannabis being one of them, is an appropriate way to go. So let's start looking for another approach than using the criminal law. So yes, that's my perspective.
I would say the shift in policy gives us the opportunity to rethink how we've approached cannabis in the past, and to really put health and social considerations front and center.
Now, up to 1 million Canadians apparently have a criminal record for possession of marijuana, and Jody, you're one of them, and in fact, your bank account was actually shut down just a few months ago. Is that correct?
That's right, and it was completely legitimate account. I pay all my taxes. There was no unusual activity, and in fact, my $200,000 financial penalty instead of prison time is based on the fact that the government knows I don't have money. It's a significant punishment. My activism was driven towards demonstrating what legalization should look like. But one of the main points we need to look at is not just that criminal law causes harm, but we need to talk about what cannabis actually is. And I touched on the fact that cannabis saved my life after I was against it. The reason was, after I tried cannabis and realized I had been lied to by the authorities that I trusted, I didn't believe them about cocaine. So I tried cocaine and I became addicted. And thank goodness for my parents and for cannabis for saving me from that. But what I need to warn listeners about is the fact that cannabis demonization and the stigmatization perpetuates an unfair and inaccurate picture of what cannabis is, and it scares people away from the safer choice. Right now in Canada, the opioid crisis is an actual drug crisis. People die, and cannabis is proven through numerous studies, including the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the U.S. government. They say dispensaries reduce opioid use, abuse, and death. And this is a crime that the government of Canada is restricting and limiting access to cannabis when it's a safer choice, not just for those using painkillers, but also recreational alcohol use, like Eugene mentioned. It's everywhere. It causes harm, death, and crime every day. Cannabis is a far safer choice, but when the government demonizes it and tells people it's dangerous and will make everyone go insane, that sort of reefer madness actually contributes to harming public health and public safety.
Rebecca, how do you feel about what Jody's saying?
I think it's very true. And we've done consultations with young people about what they know about cannabis, what they think about cannabis, and how they would like to get information. And what we've heard from them is that the scare tactics don't work. They have seen their colleagues, their friends, their peers use cannabis and not come to great harm. So they're looking to have an open, honest conversation. But we also know that a lot of adults, because they've grown up with cannabis being demonized, don't really know how to have those conversations, aren't really comfortable having those conversations. So we're looking at how to not only better communicate with youth, but also provide adults with the tools that they need to communicate with youth that helps them set aside their own biases and inform themselves about the knowledge they need in order to have those discussions.
Eugene, do you think that cannabis should be put in the same category as tobacco, as alcohol, especially for the developing brain?
No, I think. Well, no, that's not my area of competence. I'm not a psychiatrist, or that is not my area of expertise. I think we have to look at each category of drugs, though. Look at the properties. Most drugs have benefits. Most drugs have drawbacks. How do we achieve the benefits of those drugs? How do we minimize the drawbacks? So we know with tobacco that it's very problematic. The delivery system for tobacco is a dirty delivery system. That's one of the principal harms of tobacco. The nicotine isn't that problematic. It's the fact that you're consuming the nicotine by a dirty delivery system. So you're going to have to look at each category of drug and say, okay, what are the benefits of this category of drug? What are the drawbacks? How can we maximize the benefits, minimize the drawbacks, and ultimately one of the things we have to talk about is why people use drugs in the first place, and that's something that we never really get to when we talk about criminalizing drugs. We just say, thou shalt not, don't do drugs. We never really ask why people do drugs. And if you want people to reduce the harmful consumption of substances, you have to get at why they're using those drugs.
And I'd like to get back to that when we come back from the commercial break. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
The following program is brought to you by Rogers Anyplace TV. Enjoy exclusive content for free. Visit RogersAnyplaceTV.com.
Funny Footpath is the most challenging wilderness trail in Atlantic Canada.
You want to have a lot of hikes in before you go on the footpath. You need to know what you're doing when you get out there.
I'm Bruce. Despite the fact that the Funny Footpath poses a tremendous challenge, I feel like the underdog spirit is going to win out no matter what.
Surviving the Fundy Footpath, July 22nd at 8 on Documentary Channel.
My name is Rabia Siddiqui, and I'm the co-host of Projection Pakistan.
Qamar Masood, community producer of Projection Pakistan. This program comes on every third Sunday and following Saturday. In this program, we show you interviews and different activities which Pakistani community is involved in.
Celebrate Ottawa is a collection of stories for, by, and about the people, places, and rich history that make Ottawa such a vibrant place to call home. Tune in Sunday evenings at 7:30.
welcome back to Ottawa Experts. I'm your host, Barbara Balfour, and tonight we're talking about legalization of marijuana in Canada. Now, before we went to break, Jody was talking a little bit about some of the things that her husband went through across the border with, time in the jail system and so on. And so that's a good segue to a question that I wanted to bring up with regards to cross-border issues after legalization in Canada. If you're a Canadian who has consumed marijuana at some point in time and you're crossing the border, what can you legally expect to be asked, and how will that influence their decision to let you into the country, given the fact that it's prohibited there? Well,
the United States is a sovereign country. It has the right to determine, there are some limits in international law, but it has the right to determine who can enter cross its borders and enter the country. They have the right to ask you whatever questions they want. The fact that you have used cannabis legally in Canada does not mean that they are going to allow you to enter the States. This has been a long-standing problem. If you just admitted, say, that when you were 17 you tried cannabis once, you're asked by a U.S. border official, and you say, well, I tried it once when I was 17. I was never charged, I was never convicted, but I tried it at that time. They can still ban you. And that's not going to change. I think what we need to do is remind Canadians that if they are going to cross the border, A, they should never take anything across the border because they could be charged with importing into the United States. And B, even if what they're doing is perfectly legal in Canada, it may be considered an act that justifies banning them from the United States. Now, this is something that I'm sure Canadian government officials are trying to negotiate with the United States right now, but trying to negotiate anything with the United States right now is extraordinarily difficult, as I think anybody who reads the papers knows. So we don't know how that's going to play out.
Okay. Now, what about under current laws, Rebecca, if, we're in Canada and, I'm a parent who might allow my 16-year-old kid to have a glass of Prosecco at New Year's Eve? What if I decide to let my son or daughter have a puff of my joint and they're 17?
Under the Cannabis Act that comes into effect on October 17th, use will still be illegal and prohibited for youth. So as a parent, you are not permitted to permit your son, daughter, niece, nephew to use cannabis until he or she is age of majority. So in most provinces and territories, that ties into the age of alcohol use, with the exception of Manitoba. In Manitoba, you can drink alcohol at 18, but you can't use cannabis until you're 19.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you could be potentially facing a pretty stiff jail sentence.
A very hefty fine. Providing cannabis to youth has a maximum penalty of 14 years incarceration.
And that's the absurdity of this, because if you look at alcohol, you can a parent can teach their child how to use alcohol responsibly at home without being charged, and the law is quite clear on this in most jurisdictions. But with the cannabis law, a maximum penalty. I mean, nobody's going to get 14 years for teaching their 16-year-old kid how to smoke cannabis, but it's a provision that really needs to be changed at some point, because that, I would think that most parents are the best people to teach their kids how to use substances responsibly if the parents have used it themselves. Teach your kids how to drink responsibly. So you can let them have a little bit of alcohol at Christmas or at a family celebration or something like that. Why shouldn't that be the case with cannabis as well? And there's still a bit of, more than a bit of reefer madness in the legislation. It's sort of reefer madness light in some ways. This notion that we have to criminalize this conduct by parents.
Mm-hmm. And I should note that even though the maximum 14 years, which is increasing from the current or previous 7-year max, that might not be handed down, but my understanding is that it limits judges' ability to hand down lesser sentences. So right now, with the maximum being 7 years, you can get a conditional sentence or house arrest or something of the like. But with a 14-year maximum, that option is removed. And to equate cannabis in any way to child pornography, assaulting a police officer, and leaving Canada to commit terrorism, which are the other crimes that carry 14-year maximums, I think that's appalling. But again, it ties into the government's attempt to restrict and limit cannabis access, which benefits the big businesses that are already positioned and looking for monopolies and certain types of arrangements with provincial governments for wholesale. So there's something very worrisome about that these tough new laws are not based on what cannabis is, but they're designed to protect certain interests who are already well positioned to profit from this new Cannabis Act, legalization, quote unquote.
Now, Jody, you've already opened a new cafe in Toronto called Jody's Joint. Will your plans change at all after October 17? Will you be doing anything differently? Like what can we expect?
Well, I intend to use it as a lobbying center. When I think of legalization, it should be like Amsterdam, where adults can get a coffee and a joint and consume both in a civilized manner. So I hope to evolve my cafe coffee shop into a consumption space or a lounge. I believe Ontario has a rocky road ahead when the government is selling cannabis to its citizens, but giving them $1,000 fines for smoking outdoors and having people evicted for smoking indoors. You need to offer a space to use it. I'd also like to evolve into providing access to cannabis itself. I believe that might take a few years, and perhaps the Ford government might be open to letting small business owners move the government product. So yes, I hope to expand into that. But for now, it's just fantastic locally roasted coffee and hemp baked goods, hemp wallpaper, hemp oil varnish, hemp fabric, because beyond the criminal justice side of my activism, I'm an environmentalist, and I love what cannabis hemp can do for so many aspects of our health of the planet.
Are you doing anything, Jody, to set or follow certain ethical standards, or will you do so in the future when sourcing cannabis products, given the fact that cannabis is a plant and therefore consumers might be exposed to things like bacteria such as E. coli or heavy metals, fertilizers, pesticides, things like that? Can you speak to a little bit to what the regulation is in this market? Is it still buyer beware, or what kind of options do you have as someone who will be providing those products to the public?
Well, right now I'm on probation, so I'm not providing any cannabis access. The only people legally authorized to do so are licensed producers of medical marijuana. But if we look at the history of cannabis, there hasn't really been much of a negative impact on health from any of it, because people, if they have choice, will go for the best option. At our cannabis culture dispensaries, testing was done, and we don't have any products that are not able to pass our basic tests. But let's look at who the government of Canada and provincial governments are dealing with. Right now, you have Organigram, who presented themselves as an organic grower, being taken to court with a class action lawsuit for poisoning veterans with toxins. You have many reports over the years of licensed producers who are growing factory farm cannabis in prison-like conditions, using banned pesticides and even hiding them from Health Canada inspectors. And yet these same companies are making deals for millions of dollars, tax dollars, with provincial governments to be the providers of quote-unquote safe, legal cannabis. My concern is that I don't trust the government to provide a safe product, and it's already proven that they can't. My own medical marijuana provider issued a recall for products they sold last year, which patients already consumed. So when we're talking about cannabis and safety, it appears that it doesn't matter if you're the government or not. You can have problems either way. But remember that most of these problems are based on prohibition. And when you're forcing big companies to grow on a large scale, they're going to need to use toxins and pesticides, just like the majority of the food in grocery stores that we feed to children. They are covered in all sorts of toxins and chemicals unless they're organic. So we have to remember that just because there are chemicals used doesn't mean it's going to kill you. And we have to remember that in this black market, quote unquote, that the government criminal law creates, there is self-regulation amongst the good operators who are honest and decent, but there's also bad operators. And when the government criminalizes cannabis, they increase the risk, which increases the reward, which incentivizes those who would use force and violence and coercion. And when the penalties get tougher, the good people don't engage and the bad people continue to operate. So when those bad people are facing really tough penalties, it actually increases the reward, and the government is not going to be able to replace the existing market. It's bigger than mining and fishing and all that combined in British Columbia. It would be like shutting down every farmer in Canada and forcing them to start up again and pay exorbitant costs. So this government approach is not going to work.
We just have a couple of minutes left before the end of our time together, but I just want to read a post by your husband, Mark Emery, on our Facebook page. The federal and provincial governments never give freedom back to citizens. The courts do that, so it's appalling but not surprising that this legalization is more prohibition than prohibition was. Rebecca, what's your thought on what Jody's been saying from a public health and safety perspective?
I think that we have to look at the opportunity to impose quality control standards on the product as one of the key benefits of a legalized market. That's one of the ways that we're going to incentivize consumers who are now accessing from the illegal market to access through the legitimate market. But that means that we have good quality control standards, that we enforce those standards, and that we communicate to the public the benefits of a safe, controlled, clearly marked product.
The way I see it is that there are a lot of challenges that are in our way that keep us from creating a market that's not predatory. What are your thoughts? Your final thoughts?
Well, first of all, we're not going to get it right off the bat. I mean, this is we've had prohibition for 90 years. We're changing it. We've had the examples of Colorado, Washington State, Oregon, other jurisdictions that have legalized and regulated cannabis. But when we're setting it up in 13 jurisdictions across Canada, we're going to make there are going to be weak points. There are going to be strong points. We're going to learn from each other. Jurisdictions are going to learn from other jurisdictions, and over time, I think we can set up a very efficient mechanism. But I think the public has to be a bit patient in expecting, if they expect that the system is going to be perfect right off the bat, it won't be. It won't be. There are going to be weak spots and some strong points, and that's, I think, we have to find out where it's working, where it's not working, and adjust. But you can do that easily in a regulatory system. You can't do it in a prohibitionist model.
So to sum it up, we're on the right path.
Well, yeah, we're on the right path. I mean, moving away from prohibition is right. There are a lot of flaws. Jody's pointed them out. I'm sure Rebecca can identify many issues with the system, as can I. But I think we're really looking at a step in the right direction.
We're at the end of our time together, but I'd like to thank you so much, Eugene, for coming in.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Jody, for calling in, for spending some time with us tonight. When we come back after the break, we'll be joined by psychoanalyst and addictions counselor Deborah Brooks. We'll be right back. Don't go away.
Hey everyone, it's Carla from Carla in the Kitchen. Join me every week as I give away some of my top secret recipes. These smell so delicious. We'll see you in the kitchen.
Was that 4 or 5? He's lost count and still thinks he can drive. Do you think he knows that when he is caught and charged with impaired driving, he'll lose his license and a lot more? If he gets in his car, he'll face costs exceeding $20,000. Does he realize he could have a criminal record for his choice to drive? And it could be much worse if he crashes. I wonder what he'll be thinking tomorrow.
Have a hold on one at 1-5.
Visit ArriveAlive.org to find out more. Arrive Alive. Drive sober.
Maybe it's a moonlight or the moonshine. I can feel it in my bones. Number 1 for good times. Oh my God, this is my song. I've been listening to the radio. Oh. Number 1 for favorites. She can hear those church bells ringing, ringing. And up in the loft at home. Number 1 for new music. Even when I'm 1,000 miles. Number 1 for country. Country 101.1.
Hi, I'm Julie Dustin, and I'm a volunteer here at Rogers TV. I love working at Rogers TV because I'm learning the elements of television production and working with professional production crews. I've had fun on every single volunteer shift I've done because I've been challenged and I've learned something, and I've also enjoyed whatever the content of the show is that I'm working on.
Welcome back to Ottawa Experts. I'm your host, Barbara Balfour, and tonight we're talking about the legalization of marijuana in Canada. We're just joined in the studio tonight by psychotherapist and addictions counselor Deborah Brooks. She is an addictions counselor working in mental health for the last 15 years and is currently based out of Serenity Renewal for Families. And we are also joined by Rebecca Jessamine. Rebecca, tell me a little bit about some of the key messages that you had in terms of what do people need to know about cannabis and how to use it safely?
I think the most important message, and this aligns with one of the objectives of the legislation, which was to prevent use among youth, is that the greater harms that we see associated with cannabis use is for people who start use earlier, who use more frequently, who use more heavily, and who use stronger products. So for looking at protecting health, the key message is to delay use as long as possible.
Because under 25 is very problematic, right?
Under 25, so what we know is that the portion of the brain that cannabis impacts continues to develop until the mid-20s. So if you want to play it absolutely safe, wait until the mid-20s to start consuming. If you choose to consume at all, I should add that as well. But basically, the longer you delay use, then the safer it is. And if you're using, try to use less frequently. Don't consume as much at one time, and start slow. In Colorado, they have a great saying: start low, go slow. Mm-hmm. So if you're not sure of the product that you're using, start with a small dose, see how that affects you, and then you can increase if you feel the need.
Mm-hmm. Deborah, thank you so much for joining us in the studio tonight.
Thank you.
You have a name for cannabis, for marijuana.
Yes, I call it the drug of lost possibility for at least the clients I see. And keeping in mind that I see people that have been identified as having problematic use in some way. That's how they come to me. Mm-hmm.
You've brought some props in to show us.
Yes.
And I think a lot of viewers out there are kind of confused with the difference between, CBD, there's all these CBD products that are out there, THC, hemp. Walk us through some of the things that you brought us in and what does this all mean?
Well, so first of all, I went into a paraphernalia shop for the first time. They did not distribute any marijuana, just the things
just
to
the
use.
Accessories?
Yes, and I spoke to a lovely young man who explained to me these are the three most popular.
Okay.
Bong, pipe, and then the old-fashioned rolling paper, and this is the most popular brand, apparently.
So that's what you would use to make a joint?
Yes, and so in my line of work, when I'm working with somebody and it comes out that they are using marijuana, I will ask them, how are you ingesting it? Because this, to me, is problematic for lungs, and typically they're using high THC when they're doing this, back to what Rebecca was saying.
What is THC?
It's the psychoactive part of cannabis, and it's the problematic part that can be problematic for some people, and they might not necessarily know.
It's the part that gets you high, it's the part that you can get addicted to.
It's the part a lot of people like.
Yeah.
I brought a little vial of CBD. So at the clients I see, the range is from people who have been smoking for 20 plus years, and they're using these. And I will work hard to switch them to a harm reduction mode of doing it with a vape too. They were too expensive. It wasn't part of my budget to bring in. Or also, I'll work on a higher content of CBD for them. So some of my clients are middle-aged people dealing with chronic illness, and this will help them sleep rather than a sleeping pill, and helps with chronic pain as well. And back to what Eugene was saying, I would much rather see somebody use this as opposed to an opiate.
So you can get addicted to these things.
The CBD is much less problematic. The THC and smoking it, for me, is problematic in my work. And one other I should mention, and there's kind of an interesting little story with this, is, well, that's the brand. It's a popular store. An edible, this, the person shared with me, was split between 5 people.
So it's a chocolate bar?
It was like a peanut butter cup.
Okay.
Split between 5 people equally. 3 people were fine, and 2 were non-functional. They were so high from it. So I thought that was interesting too. That's the challenge with the edibles, is how much am I getting? Mm-hmm. And, what's the effect going to be?
Now, and this edible peanut butter cup was purchased here in Ottawa?
Yes.
So you can find them freely now?
And without
prescription, without anything. Yeah, that's very interesting. We have a caller on the line. I believe the caller's name is Eugene, but I don't think it's the same person that was on the show. Are you on the line?
I am.
Thank you so much for calling in. Did you have a question for our guests?
I do. I've actually been to Amsterdam, and when I was in Amsterdam, you can smoke marijuana inside the cafe, but it's against the law to smoke it outside in public. Are we going to have anything kind of restrictions like that in our areas?
That's interesting.
So it depends on what province you live in, to be honest. So in Ontario, you cannot use in public, and Ontario does not currently permit consumption in a licensed premises. So there's no cannabis cafe. Nunavut is actually looking at having a cannabis cafe model, and part of that is in response to the fact that if you think about potential places to use, a place like Nunavut where using on your front porch when it's -40 is a bit problematic, but because of overcrowding in houses, if you require people to use inside, then you're looking at secondhand smoke exposure to a lot of family members and potentially youth as well. So in Ontario, short answer, no cannabis cafes like in Amsterdam at this time, but there is space in the legislation to open that and consider it in the future.
Thanks for calling in, Eugene. Jody's story was interesting in our last segment because her story was the opposite of what we typically think of cannabis. Many people who fear cannabis fear that it's going to be a gateway drug to harder substances, and her story made it seem like it was something that weaned her off of the harder substances. What are your thoughts on that, Deborah?
Oh, I certainly see that. I have had people use cannabis to get off of alcohol, that their alcohol use was so bad, seizures and different things, and when they were having cravings, that's what they'd do. You know, okay. So I supported that as the less damaging of the two.
So you do see some benefits to cannabis in this realm?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think Eugene touched on a very good point. Why are people using the substances? Yeah. Why do people want to get high? And that's what my work's about. Often it's pain, trauma, young people starting, it's an escape. You know, and the people that are most susceptible are the ones that, wow, this is such a relief and I feel blissed out and I want more of this feeling because my life is horrible. Now, I mean, that's not always the case. I think some people just, you know, like to go out and have a good time and somebody else is smoking but yeah, it's that's my bigger concern, is why do people want to use it? Why are all substances so popular, especially alcohol, the opiates, and cannabis?
And overall, your stance is pro-decriminalization and legalization?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
We have a caller on the line. Anne, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Thank you so much for calling in. Did you have a question for our guests?
Yes, I do. My question is in regards to secondhand smoke. When people, I mean, now that it will be legal, people smoking in the vicinity of other people, how will secondhand smoke then affect the passerbys or even children and their forming brains? And are we discussing that? I haven't really heard anybody discuss this kind of issue yet.
Very valid point. What has been your experience, Rebecca, in this realm?
Unfortunately, with cannabis being illegal for so long, it's prevented doing a lot of research. Yeah. And the effects of secondhand smoke are one of the areas of research that are going to be critically important to address. We have some basic information in terms of, you know, combusting any plant material produces toxic chemicals, but the extent to which those are to the harms of exposure from secondhand, we don't have the same level of information that we have for tobacco yet.
Do you remember that Olympian, gosh, how many years ago was it? Ross Rebegliati?
Yes.
Yeah. Any validity to what he was saying, do you think?
I mean, yes, it would be the short answer in terms of if you are consuming, if you're around a group where there is a density of secondhand smoke, and there can be an intoxicating effect passively if you're in a closed space. But again, we don't have the science in terms of how much of a risk and to what degree that impairment would be present. And we know with all impairment, it varies by the individual and again, the strength of product that's being used, how it's being used, is it being smoked through combustion. A lower risk way, both for the individual using and for the people around them, is vaporizing.
Yeah. Thanks for calling in, Anne. I want to get into alcohol addictions, and for a long time, I think we still do trivialize and glamorize alcohol consumption. Yeah. You see that in your practice, Deborah. What do you see as some of the parallels and the lessons we can learn?
Well, that's probably my biggest fear. Because it's legal, often people will say to me, oh, I never use drugs, I just drink. And I remind them, that's the worst drug I see. You know, the most devastating, the most lethal, the most damaging to families. So I'm concerned that when things become legal, people cease to see it as a drug. And then I know there are some, they've thought about this, about glamorizing it and promoting it, but there's a lot of money invested in this, and I'm very, very concerned about the promotion and glamorization. Actually, when I went into this paraphernalia shop, as I walked in, there was an ad for a vape that was in rose gold. And I thought, oh my God, they're advertising to my, this is for women, probably older, that want an accessory, so it matches everything. Wow. So I'm very concerned about that part.
And I've actually read studies that have come out in Europe that female working professionals who are also calorie conscious, looking for a way to unwind after work, may actually choose smoking a joint as opposed to having a glass or two of wine after work. And so I think it'll be very interesting going forward to see some of these new emerging demographics and industry trends. And Rebecca, you have a lot to say about that from a marketing and policy perspective.
Definitely. From a research perspective, too, in terms of the impact on alcohol consumption of cannabis legalization is a fascinating question. But there's so much we can learn from the way alcohol marketing has operated. I mean, we know that reducing outlet density can reduce levels of consumption. So we can apply that lesson to locating cannabis outlets as well. We know that there's price sensitivity to alcohol consumption, particularly among youth. So if we're looking at ways to reduce consumption, price sensitivity is one of the ways that we can do that.
I want to hear more about that. We're just about to go to break. When we come back, we'll be talking more about the legalization of marijuana in Canada.
Ladies and gentlemen, I will endeavor to describe the feeling on this ship. The American ship is just trailing the Blue Nose.
Angus should never have agreed to this last race. She's too old.
Eddie!
Johnson, halyard back! Get to it, man!
Appears there's some kind of difficulty. There seems to be something loose up there, I believe. The topsail's foul!
Just once more, old girl, and you can rest.
Her last race and still undefeated, the Blue Nose out of Lunenburg, Nova Scotia was fastest in the world for almost 20 years.
Launching a canoe from a dock is a simple procedure. The paddle partner should climb aboard by placing one hand on the dock for balance and the other on the outside gunwale of the canoe. Then, you swing the stern of the canoe close to the dock, and the stern paddler climbs aboard using the same procedure. Once settled, push away from the dock and paddle away.
Are you the type who would keep going or stop? It's not easy to stop when you have an addiction. Legalizing cannabis won't stop addiction. It trivializes its consumption. Let's be vigilant. If you need help, visit portage.ca.
Welcome back to Ottawa Experts. I'm your host, Barbara Balfour. Deborah, before we went to break, we were talking a little bit about, marijuana and alcohol and some of the parallels between the two. Can you get addicted to marijuana, and what would that look like? How would you know that you have a problem?
So, physical addiction would be, so yes, you can, and the physical addiction would look like you can't function without it. That to be normal, you have to be using. And you'd be in extreme distress when you're not. So agitated, angry, restless. And there are even some cases of people using it so chronically and so physically addicted where they're vomiting constantly. I've only heard about this a few times, and the solution for it and how they ask in the hospital to determine if this is what it is, does a warm shower help you? Does it help the symptoms subside? So yes, there are some pretty extreme cases. And I'll even say too, another area, I didn't really believe so much about the mental health impact until I had a client hospitalized for 5 months with marijuana-induced schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. And you know, the psychiatrist said, we see this all the time with chronic use. So there's a myriad of things that can happen to people. And
I've heard the stats that apparently, especially if you have a propensity towards mental illness and schizophrenia, it only takes one time.
And how do you know if you have a propensity for it?
Yeah.
You know? And then I work more in the range or the realm of dependence, where somebody's been a chronic smoker and they're not going to come off, and we're just looking at harm reduction. My preference is to work in the area of problematic use, where the person can identify it themselves. You know, maybe their life isn't working, they're not gainfully employed, they're spending way too much in the basement gaming, they're just not doing what they intend to do. And you know, often people won't associate it with the cannabis, though, that they see as a solution to other problems. What I have seen quite a bit with some of the younger people I work with is they say, oh, I'm taking it for my anxiety. We discuss a period of sobriety and they realize they don't have anxiety, that it was the cannabis. So that's kind of interesting too.
I was going to ask you a question about what safe recreational use of marijuana would look like, but then I was so surprised, you know, before we went to break, when you brought in the edible peanut butter chocolate cup to show us, because edibles are not actually legal in Canada for another year. Rebecca, what are your thoughts on that? And how can we use safely in this kind of climate where anything goes and you can get anything anywhere?
Again, it comes to public education, and I think we really need to start that communication, start that dialogue. I know Health Canada has started with some public education messaging, but letting people know that, you know, you asked how do I know if I'm at risk for mental health concerns, because there is a statistical significantly relationship between cannabis use and psychosis. But if you have a family history, that's one of the things to be aware of. We know that cannabis use can be associated with lower birth rate for people who use while pregnant, so that's another important message. Very important message is the impact on driving ability, especially when used with alcohol. So youth today, they get it, you don't drink and drive, but a lot of them think that it's okay to use cannabis and drive. So from a public safety perspective, that's a really important message to get across.
Now that's kind of grounds for debate, you know, around, well, we already have legislation in place for, you know, people who are on the road who have consumed cannabis. That's sort of out there, but how can it be enforced? Like if someone gets pulled over and the officer suspects that they're high, they're under the influence, you know, how is that enforced? And do you think that legislation is enough? Well, what are your thoughts on what's out there right now for road safety?
Sure. We have legislation that is in place and that has withstood judicial challenge, so it's been validated. And basically it's the good old behavioral roadside test, where you have a specially trained officer who knows what physical symptoms to look for and can determine based on those symptoms not only whether or not you're impaired, but what you're impaired by. So we have that capacity. What we don't quite have enough of, unfortunately, is specially trained officers. And that speaks to the fact that, again, going back to the idea that legalization isn't a simple solution. Simply because we legalize doesn't mean there's no longer police involvement. We do need to continue to invest in enforcement as well as prevention, treatment, education, administration of the regulations, etc. So we can't look at this as simply a cost-saving message. There's a lot of investments that we need to make in order to make this a success.
And speaking of investments, do we have enough officers who are trained in that kind of detection?
I think we certainly need more.
Yeah. Yeah. Deborah, one of our viewers wrote into Facebook asking a question about the difference between addiction versus self-medication. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's certainly an overlap. Often use starts as self-medication, and then it becomes bigger than the initial problem. So, yeah, they can certainly go together. And eventually, when I'm addicted, now I'm medicating the withdrawal. I can't function without it. So yes, a lot of drug use is self-medication.
In today's climate, is teaching your children abstinence from marijuana realistic? What do you think?
I think that we can still give the message that the safest approach is not to consume any intoxicant. The same goes for alcohol, tobacco. But I think it's important to be realistic and even to recognize that youth are using today. We know that the demographic 18 to 25 is the highest rate of use right now. So I think, again, it comes back to the importance of being comfortable having that dialogue with youth, communicating with them in a way that resonates and isn't based on scare tactics and is rooted in fact. Youth are looking for information, but they're going to Google. And that doesn't necessarily give you reliable information.
And that was going to bring me to my next question. Where do you go to get reliable information on cannabis?
Certainly Health Canada is, has a website they're developing. The organization that I work with, the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, has multiple resources on our site, and we're also coming out with a cannabis communication guide to help adults talk to youth. The Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in Ontario is also a good site for resources. So there's good information out there.
Deborah, how would you counsel clients of yours who are parents on how to talk to their kids?
Well, I would first suggest to parents that they keep an eye, they watch for changes in behavior, and they, simple parenting rules, have the kids in, know who they're socializing with. Be involved and watch for changes, and not be, keep an open dialogue so it's not punitive and they're free to talk to you and ask you questions. That it's really important that you have an idea of what your kids are doing. Yeah, and I think back to, it's not legal, but any teenage or any teenager in high school could probably get their hands on it within about 10 minutes at school. That's the bottom line, and it's always been that way. So education, education, education. Yeah.
I remember even growing up as a teenager, which is longer ago than I care to admit. There were certain parts of town where you knew if you were walking on that street corner, there would be someone offering you something. What are your thoughts, Rebecca, on the validation or the assertion that legalizing marijuana can cut back on organized crime? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that the illegal market is going to continue. It's strongly established, as Jody was discussing earlier, but I think we have the opportunity to start incentivizing people to access through the retail market. Most people who aren't current users or current heavy users would prefer to go to a legal source, right? There are illegal sources of tobacco and alcohol, but most people still buy from, a convenience store or the LCBO when they go to buy their alcohol and tobacco, because they know it's a controlled supply. They don't have to worry about contaminants, and they don't have to fear, police response for making the purchase. So I think we have to work on that incentivizing and public education.
We just got a question on Facebook from one of our viewers wondering about employer tests for drugs and for impairments. So the question was, urine tests don't necessarily show impairment with marijuana. What are your thoughts on how that landscape might change in the workplace?
I think really, and actually my organization has recently put out a report on this, and at the end of the day, workplace substance use policies should cover all substances and should cover intoxication. And the contexts where that's really an issue is in safety-sensitive roles. And there's legal precedent that speaks to when an employer is and is not allowed to test for impairment. And there are a lot of considerations. Of course, cannabis has complications in terms of the potential for medical use. And whether, really it's up to the employer to develop a policy that is suited to the needs of the organization and also respects the employees, where if it is a dependence issue, that it's dealt with not in a stigmatizing way, but in a supportive way.
Mm-hmm. We only have a few minutes left till the end of our show tonight, but Deborah, did you have some?
Well, I was just going to say an important thing that I don't know is well known is that cannabis will stay in your system for a good month, where alcohol, it's out within 24, 48 hours, even cocaine, it's the longest one. So often, if you're going to go through those testing for employment, it's good to not use for a good month before.
Mm. But also, a lot of what you see in the papers about employment testing is coming out of the United States. Mm. It's much, much narrower in Canada in terms of where it's acceptable to require pre-employment testing for substances.
And we only have 2 minutes left until the end of our show. Did you have some final parting thoughts for our viewers, Deborah?
I would just say if somebody is using cannabis and they think it's impacting their life in maybe a less than positive way, reach out and talk about it. No one's going to force you to stop, but it's a good ongoing dialogue to have, and make sure you're within a healthy range for yourself. Take care of your mental health.
And probably one positive thing, it feels like there isn't as much stigma around cannabis as there is around other drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. 1 minute left till the end of our show. Rebecca, what parting thoughts did you have for our viewers, and where can we find you to get more information?
Sure. So you can go to www.ccsa.ca for more information on some of the concerns, health risks, and also ways to mitigate those health risks.
And any other thoughts that you wanted to share in terms of where we're going and what you think we need to be particularly cognizant of?
I'd echo Eugene's sentiment in that we're not going to get it perfect right off the bat, but we need to do the research, do the monitoring, look at the data, what's working, what's not working, and what do we need to change, and we need to be flexible enough to adapt as we learn.
Lots of room for further discussion, for sure.
And it's a start, and it's real, and people are using it, so we might as well be talking about it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, ladies, for joining us tonight and for your time. It's been a great discussion. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the studio next week. Have a good night.